All right, did some research last night and found out a few things. And I just wanted to talk a minute this morning about some of the things I found that might help people with problems they're having with their carburetor. Um, this little float needle here is probably an original or a fairly late one because it's got the steel tip to it. A lot of the replacement float needles have a little, what almost looks like a little rubber nipple tip on the end there. I think it's a Viton seal or some kind of, fuel resistant, hopefully ethanol fuel additive resistant type of synthetic rubber. And a lot of people say that, oh, that makes a better seal. And then you got some guys that, oh, they lament for the days when you could find the kits that had the solid steel ones because they believe this is the better way to go. I guess one of the problems with the rubber tip ones is that you can end up with a problem where if the tractor is sitting for a while and the float bowl is full of fuel, for instance, say you didn't shut the fuel line off and you didn't run the carburetor, let the engine run down, what'll happen is your float will be in the fully up position, which will be keeping this closed, and that little rubber nipple will be sitting in there, and it can actually get stuck in there. So then what happens is when you go to run the carburetor, when you go to run the engine, of course turn the fuel on, or turn the engine on, I should say, tractor runs, starts to use fuel, and then what will happen is the bowl will actually start to go down, and that's supposed to allow this to fall out a little bit and let some more fuel in to replenish the bowl. And what happens is that little rubber nipple stuck in there, so this basically just stays in there. So even though the bowl moves down, this gets stuck in there. And it gets stuck in there, and then your engine starves for fuel, it leans out and then dies. So that's one potential problem with that. Now, a lot of people notice that on the kits that have the little rubber nipple, there's a little tiny spring that hooks onto a little spot on the back of this, which isn't on this one. But if we had one of the ones with the rubber nipples, I could show you. It's got usually a slot with a little tiny spring that sits in there. And then the other part of the spring actually hooks onto a spot somewhere on the bowl here. And what that does is that makes sure that when this bowl tilts down, that it gives a little pull on that needle and make sure that it comes out. So that's what would keep it from sticking. So if you get a kit with a Viton tipped needle and it comes with the little spring, if you're replacing one of these old steel ones, you probably want to put the spring in. So that's what I wanted to talk about as far as that goes. And then the other thing is a lot of guys talk about seating these. That goes back to, again, this older steel style where you actually would take the needle and put it in like that and then actually tap it very lightly with a hammer. Give it one good tap. And the idea is that you're now matching, theoretically, some guys swear by this, but you're now basically making a little tiny dent in the bottom of that seat that perfectly matches the shape of the needle here. Well, I don't know about that. But problem is, some guys talk about doing that with the new rubber-tipped needles. Well, what happens then is you end up damaging the rubber tip. You tend to deform it in a way so that you can almost guarantee it's going to want to tend to get stuck in there or leak. So don't do that with the rubber-tipped needles. Another tip that a carburetor rebuilder had posted, and it solved the problem for one guy, was that he had acquired a new kit, new seat, and he was having all kinds of problems with it. And what they found in that case was that if you look really closely, from the top, you can see this is almost like a triangle shape. It's a three-sided deal. And these sides are actually pretty smooth and almost flattened out. And what he found was that on a lot of the newer kits, probably, I hate to be on the Chinese bashing wagon, but probably foreign made, Quality control is not very tight, so what he ended up finding out was that on some of them, those edges were sharper and the clearance wasn't correct. So what would happen is they wouldn't just fall right out nice like this one does. And what he found was that he takes a little emery board and just kind of gives it a little quick file or rub down on the sides there on the corners, and that's just enough to improve the clearance so that they worked. So that might be a tip that might help somebody. So that's why I wanted to mention it. All right, and one more quick tip I want to pass along that made sense to me when I read it, and that was somebody talking about a problem where their needle would be sticking if the tractor sat for a while. And what their recommendation was that when you're done using the tractor and you're going to be putting it, putting it away for a week or longer. Of course, longer, there's other things you want to consider, but let's just say it's going to sit for a week. What you want to do is you want to shut your fuel supply off. Typically at a sediment bowl, you're going to have a shut off there. And you want to shut the fuel supply off with the engine running and let the engine run a little bit. And when it starts to lean out, shut off the ignition switch. The effect that has is that has the effect of draining down the bowl on the carburetor to a low level. So what that has the effect of doing is that now your float's going to be sitting down here and your seat is not going to be fully seated. Your needle's not going to be fully seated. The idea being if it's not fully seated, there's less of a chance of it being stuck. So that's the theory anyways. And you know what? There's no harm in that. And it's always a good habit to get into of shutting off your fuel shut off at your sediment bowl, or if you don't have one, you can put a little inline ball valve in there. It's always a good habit to get into because you don't want a situation where you walk away from the tractor and think that your bowl's perfectly fine, and then for some reason it doesn't seal right and gas pours out all over the place. Or worse yet, gas gets into your crankcase. So that's pretty much it for the tips that I can think of that I picked up last night that I'm going to try and commit to memory and wanted to pass on. So now let's talk about the float height. Oops. The needle seat here, I screwed it in and I forgot to put the little washer in that goes underneath it, so that wasn't good. Because of course the problem there is without this washer in, fuel could leak around that connection and get into the bowl when it's not supposed to. So I'm going to take that out and put it back in. Alright, so I've got the IT manual for the International Harvesters, which has a lot of good information in it, but it doesn't have anywhere near as much information as you would get with a full service manual. Not only that, but I also get the problem here, which it says non-diesel models are equipped with an IH 1 1/4 inch updraft type carburetor. Correct. The procedure for disassembling and overhauling the unit is conventional and evident after examination. Refer to an IH parts catalog for calibration data. Well, I don't have a parts catalog, and if I go on the online website, I can't find anything on the Case International website in the online parts catalog that would, tell me what the heck to do here. So then I just kind of Googled around looking for float height adjustments on this carburetor and just IH carburetors in general. I was able to find, I did have another bit of literature that the guy gave me with the tractor. It was actually a bunch of photocopied pages from, it looked like an original service manual. The problem is he didn't know what he had for a tractor. So that service manual covers a bunch of models, and the closest thing to what this tractor actually is it references a Farmall 340. So I went and looked in that section there on the Farmall 340, and it talks about how, well, there were several different carburetors used, and it talks about the different models that were used, and of course they're all Zenith or Marvel Schebler. It doesn't even talk about International Harvester carburetors, so I think that might predate this tractor. This tractor's a 58, maybe the 340 was, like, I don't know, early 50s or something. And maybe back then, IH wasn't making their own carburetors or whatever. So what it did say, though, was that all of the different versions of those carburetors that we used back then on the 340 were, I believe, 1.25 inch, updraft carburetors, so similar style carburetor. They all, whether they were Marvel Schebblers or Zeniths, all used a 1 5/16 inch float height adjustment, which is a decimal of 0.15625, which I'll get to that in a minute. So I'm going to see how close the current float height is to this if all else fails. But for right now, okay, so what I've got is on the next page in the I&T manual, I've got float setting. Distance from farthest face of float to gasket surface of throttle body when inlet needle is closed is 1 5/16 inch. Okay, so that jives with what I found on those other ones. Okay, good. This float setting provides a fuel level of 9/16 to 21/32 inch. Aha! All right, so that makes sense because in the front of the book here we've got condensed service data, and under the tune-up section there is a, where is it here? I just had it. Carburetor fuel level, and it says that for all models covered in this book, including the 350U, the fuel level is 9/16 inch, which that kind of, I didn't understand what they were talking about. Now I kind of understand what they're talking about. So what they're saying is, they're saying if we set the bowl height to 1 5/16 inch, what's going to happen, and that's with the needle closed, what's going to happen is when the tractor's running, the bowl's going to keep maintaining the fuel level and allowing fuel to come in to maintain a fuel level of 9/16 inch in the bowl. So in other words, from the bottom of the bowl up to 9/16 inch, that's where your fuel level should be sitting. If it's set wrong and it's too high, what can happen is you're going to start pulling more fuel up in through these passages than you want to, and the thing's going to want to flood out or run way too rich. And then, of course, if your fuel level is much lower than 9/16 inch, you're going to have a problem where it's not going to draw properly. It's going to lean out or not run at all. So that's why we want to try and keep that fuel level at 9/16 inch, which we do that by setting our float bowl at 1 5/16 or 0.15625. So I'll show you how we're going to do that now. Okay, first step is, of course, reinstall the float with the hinge pin. And now, where do you measure from? Well, we're measuring from the gasket surface of the top of the carburetor body. So that's this surface here. We're measuring from that surface to the highest point on the bowl. So if we look at the bowl from the side, you'll notice that we've got this little tip right here because of the fact that this is at an angle. This is going to be a little bit higher or a little bit further away from here than this point is. So we're going to measure from here to here. And we want this distance from here to here, right there. We want that to be 1 5/16 inch on both bladders. So in other words, I'm going to check it on this side, and then I'm going to flip it around, and I'm going to check it on that side. Now, I can't find my vernier caliper right now. So that bothers me because I use the damn thing a lot. But for now, what I'll do is I'll just use this metal scale, machinist scale, and I will find where the heck on this thing 5/16 is, and then we'll do a measurement. And basically all we're going to do is hold this right on here like that and figure out where we are. So let me just check. I got to put this down so I can see the tiny marks. All right, so I see I've got a problem right here. When I look at this dead on, you can see that this one is, this bladder is definitely higher, and it's also kind of pushed out to the side. That's not good at all, because not only is that going to give me a height mismatch, this is obviously higher than this side. The other problem is when it's torqued or twisted in that fashion, what can happen is you can actually get a problem where the side of the bladder will actually rub on the inside of the bowl and cause it to hang or stick, and that'll just give you all kinds of fits. So you gotta make sure that that's not the case. So I'm going to try and rebend this one back into position gently. So how I'm bending this is I'm going to take needle nose pliers and I'm going to grab as close as I can, and this is the point where I'm trying to bend this back or twist this back down into position. Very important that you don't try and grab just the bladder and turn or twist the bladder, because you can actually break it right off where it's soldered onto the arm here. Okay, I gave it one minor tweak and I now have it close, but I can still see that this one on the right is still a little twisted. Alright, so I'm not sure how well this is showing up on the camera, but now I've got that bowl set to a 1 5/16 of an inch, and this one here is also 1 5/16 of an inch. So now I've got my height correct. So now I've just got to check the alignment. I'm going to put it in the bowl and carefully listen while rotating the bowl back and forth to see if I can hear any scraping. Alright, even just putting the bowl on as I was sliding it down, I could definitely hear some rubbing. So what I need to do is I need to figure out which way I need to tweak these bladders so that that stops. Looking down, it looks like the clearance on the inside here on this bladder is really tight, and I've got more room on the outside here, so I would say initially this bladder right here is probably rubbing on the inside here. So let's try and adjust that. Alright, it's getting better, but it's still not giving me full movement, and when I just went to pull up on the bowl a tiny bit, I heard the float fall back down, so I know it was sticking again. I'm starting to wonder whether or not this metal part right here, this tang that is bent downward, I'm wondering if that's what's rubbing. Because it looks like I've got good clearance on the sides, but it's still rubbing like a son of a gun. So I'm going to bend this back vertical to where it should be. There, now that's not flared downward, so I'll try it again. Another thing you can listen for is as you're sliding the bowl back into place, if you do it very carefully and you keep the holes lined up as you're lowering it, if you hear that kind of telltale scrape sound of the cast iron bowl on the light brass metal of the float, then you pretty much know it's probably going to be rubbing a little bit. So you can back it off and then recheck your clearance. But I think I've got it.